Sure. Well, yeah, I'm aware of it. Not only in the broader context of healthcare, or in this case mental health, because it has an impact there, but also with regard to your coverage of it. I would say that I know that the state has the plan, you know, where the executive branch has a number of agencies coming together, and they have a 4-part plan. I like where that plan is going, but I think there should be some legislative oversight more to that, if only because the way that they've divided up that plan, you know, the first part of the plan, as a matter of fact, I've got it here, to prevent the opioid misuse and abuse, and then you go down to treat the abuse, or then prevent the deaths and overdose, and then use data to detect opiate misuse and use. So, yeah, I do a lot of project management in my career. And typically, some type of oversight would come overarching that type of paradigm, because I think that there will be things that are missed if you go into the details of how the plan is shaping up. In this case, as an IT professional, if you look at point 4, which is the data aspect of it, trying to leverage that to see trends that are happening, course correct, if you will, it's mostly focused right now on stabilizing and trying to define their terms for how we will measure those benchmarks. And without an oversight, I think what you're going to find is that you're missing a big opportunity in the first point, which is where I think we have our biggest opportunity for bang for a buck. And in this regard, if you want to prevent it, which saves a ton of cost downstream, then you want to leverage IT, and you want to leverage data in a way up front that prevents it. In this case, when we've done major projects down in Silicon Valley, in the healthcare industry, for example, with Kaiser Permanente, it's an agreed upon expectation that every individual player can potentially know all of the parameters that go into any given activity. But if you expect or plan that every one of them is going to operate 100% effectively as a cohesive unit, even though you have departments over here and departments over here and different players, then you're setting yourself up for failure, because you'll never get 100% throughput. That's where IT comes in, and that's what we usually design our systems around, is to provide those parameters that says we're not going to expect you to remember 100% of the business process on this one focus, because we know you have 1,000 other business processes you have to focus, so we're going to code the software to do that. And that's where I think we have the biggest bang for our buck. And of course, as an IT professional, I see that, and that's where I would like to see the legislature step in to leverage data up front, so that when a pharmacist is potentially prescribing it, or filling out the prescription rather, or when a doctor is prescribing it, they have an interface up front that allows them that data real time, instead of kind of in a post-analysis where you get to step 4.
Just to clarify, it's not only the reporting back up to the legislature, but also among the groups who are touching things, as you know,
sure,
the doctors would get more information.
So now in step 1, if you look into the details of it, they talk about, well, we want to make this more frequent. We want to increase the frequency maybe from a weekly to a daily. Okay, well, when you speak in terms of that, let's speak in terms of how that reporting happens. Because when you speak of in terms of reporting, are you expecting a doctor to have to read daily reports? Or would you rather build that into the system that empowers them through their interface that they already do? That's where you want to meet them, and that's where you'd want to leverage IT to do that.
Does the state have the kind of horsepower to pull that off?
The horsepower in terms of we're going to give you dollars to do this, that's not allocated. You need legislative priority. But with regard to a statewide oversight that engages in that regard, to say, hey, task force, all you that are working point 4, let's make sure that you actually have a touch point with phase 1 to integrate the two, because they don't have. I don't see that in their plan right now, and that's an area where I think I could provide some oversight, or certainly from a legislative standpoint. Certainly willing to fund some dollars there to make sure that they have that cohesive blend. Otherwise, all you do is you get, I mean, we've seen the same thing happen in education, right? A number of our teachers have said, well, gosh, we're spending all this time reporting, and I never see the benefit. What's, you know, I don't know, my kid's tested this way, I can't course correct. Oh, I see it after the school year's over. Well, the kids are gone now, they're moved up a grade. I can't act upon that with that group of kids. Yeah. So that's where you want to start seeing the actual feet on the ground of the data coming back, and so you design it into the system.
Is that a deficiency in our state? And I'm thinking more like employment ranks. Like, do we have an office that, what you're saying is analysis, basically, right? Data collection and analysis and sharing.
Well, okay, so as a whole, I don't want to say that the state is missing it, but it's a maturity that the software industry has stepped into over the past couple decades to realize that data collection in and of itself does not solve the problem. And then reporting of that doesn't necessarily solve the problem. It maybe gives you a good lessons learned type of scenario. But what about the integrating of it real time so that the decision maker up front that you don't necessarily want to involve in the data collection and analysis part is still empowered by it when they make a decision? That's where you get the crux. And if you don't have an overarching facility to do that, or if you don't even know to even look for it, then you potentially miss a lot of areas where you find the biggest ROI when it comes to leveraging data. And so that's an area that specifically I think my skill set helps articulate, and that I would try to put a focus on, because ultimately the individual endeavors of these 4-point plans to help opiate use are not only altruistic, but they're pursuing good goals.
Okay, let's use an example.
Yeah.
We've interviewed a lot of folks the last couple of weeks, and one of the things that comes up is that a person who is addicted is able to go to 4 or 5 different providers and get the same prescription. So they're enabling getting all the drugs they want.
Sure.
So part of that problem, why they're able to do that, is that there is no system in effect right now out of the doctor's office that goes to a level, maybe like what you're talking about, so that when he goes or she goes to the next doctor to get the same thing, they go, wait a minute, you just got this yesterday.
Exactly.
We can't. Is what you're talking about, is that going to take care of that kind of a problem with the addicts?
Well, it would. The first thing you have to note is that embedded into the system, and I imagine you guys have the study since I know you've reported on it. It exists. That problem exists at a micro local level, like a municipality. But the way the system is currently designed, they're only trying to address it at a macro level up to the county level. So eventually, even if you solved it there with the way that they're going, you would still have somebody that could take advantage of it because they could just go across county lines. If the
So this isn't going to solve that problem.
Well, my solution would. It would bring that overarching state type of paradigm to it. Now, when you get into that level and you want to say up front, before we go spend all this money developing these reports, let's make sure that the data we use is going to be integrated back into a way that the people up front that want to prevent it or that are actually prescribing it are empowered with that data to say, hey, whoa, there's a red flag here. You want to make sure that that not only crosses municipal lines, but also state or county lines.
Same would apply to law enforcement, I imagine.
Sure.
Law enforcement having that data between the agencies,
Yeah.
being to talk county to county and all the rest of that.
I mean, it's not, don't get me wrong, I mean, I can come up here and tell you that, yeah, there's a magical solution for it. It won't be easy. You run into data security problems at that point.
Yeah, that's what I was going, how would you
Yeah.
do that? Wouldn't you be having a lot of information about each individual that is daily?
So now,
Because there's HIPAA.
if you were to do it, if you brought in the state patrol, that you're going to run into really hairy instances there. So let's carve that out.
Okay.
If you're talking about at the higher level, you can base it off of a generic enough of a plan that you could tie the purchase of these to a prescription ID as opposed to a person. That way it's not necessarily tied to a person. And if you pursue that type of route, then the solution that you have is the trigger happens off of the ID, not the person. And so even if they tried to take that prescription and hand it to somebody else to get it for them, it's still flagged. So the pharmacist says, hey, that ID's just been used in the past 2 days to buy multiple times. No, we're going to flag this. And all of a sudden you can bring it back. And all of a sudden, because of the prescription ID, as opposed to the person. And if you pursue that route, you're saving and protecting personal privacy rights, but at the same time, you're still giving an actionable type of thing.
But then
That's
what
what I would
happens to
advocate
this person that decides, well, okay, I can't get this prescription filled anymore, so they just get it on the street?
Well, what happens if anybody breaks the law on the street? I mean, what I'm advocating for here is a broader approach that couples with and complements this so that we have better ROI as a result of the effort. I don't know if we're going to solve every problem overnight. Yeah.
Aren't they continuing to work on this? Because
Oh, they are.
they're
This is
putting
ongoing.
together a steering committee.
Oh, I allowed the
continue
work. The work is good. If you, I'm not citing any fault in the work. What I'm saying is at a broader level, especially coming from the background that I do, I can see some areas that if you had a little bit of an umbrella approach over the top of it, you could empower it, make it more impactful. Well, I've read your notes or the articles that you've written about Lloyd, who came up and talked about it. It's Pendleton, or?
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to say Pendleton, but I know it's not Pendleton. So, the first thing I'd note is that I think that there's some areas that we could model after that, and I'm not opposed to a get them in the home first type of scenario. I don't know that I want to implement a state-wide mandate on how to do it. I wouldn't mind seeing different models. That's kind of the brilliance of local governance. We'll get to see which ones really pan out, because even the local machinations of how we would do it aren't going to follow exactly how Utah is doing it. Whether it's resource constrained, whether you have the big single cell centers that they have, or it's more dispersed, that could have an impact. And we might find out if you mandate that you're just going to do it, but then you don't measure or look at whether or not Utah's model, where they have people more in a grouped facility, and they only have, I think about 8 located throughout the state, as opposed to what if you had 8 in the Kitsap County area, which works better. We need to figure that out, and if we do, we can find which actual version, because there are bomb throwers on either side for political, ideological reasons that want to affect this space. I think I've carved out a pretty good reputation bipartisanly with regard to homelessness issues. And so what I would advocate for is letting a couple different models take place to see which one really works, because I would hate for one model to be espoused over the state and see it not work, and then have whichever side wants to lobby their point and say, see, we told you so, kill what potentially is showing a program that's showing good results. So in that regard, a couple different machinations of it I think would be prudent. It would also allow us to account for different county-based funding differences and geographical differences. And because some of the bigger counties might be huge geographically and have no real major metropolitan or urban center. So how do you do? Maybe that's a model where you should try more remote, smaller places to try to accommodate this. Certainly, I think there's an area too for the tribes, especially when you get over to either Colville or Yakima, where you've got a bigger swath of land.
Well, so are you thinking there would be state funding for this or not?
I'm willing to support some state funding, but most of the funding right now that they've talked to has come from the county level. But this gets back broader to mental health. It gets back to the discussion that we just had, and that is you have what I believe is starting to show to be a broken model, where the state is a part-time legislature and we're tasked with funding it. And then you have counties that are tasked with actually delivering the goods in any one of these categories. And what you're seeing from the state level is this desire to come and fix it. So usually, because they're appropriating the funds, they're putting a lot of strings attached to it. You should do it this way. In mental health, if we want to use that as a prime example, Kitsap County could have a lot more beds, but they're forced to follow some of the strings that Pierce and King have negotiated into the provisos that are put on this money at the state level. So they're forced to follow a model that might work for Pierce or King, but Kitsap can't deliver it under that same model because it's just geography is different. And as a result, it makes them adopt methodologies or practices that aren't necessarily as effective, and really limits the amount of good that it can do because it's accommodating that. So what I would advocate for is the part-time legislature removing some of these and giving it to the counties and letting them do it.
You mean sort of like a block grant type of program?
It would certainly, I know that Kitsap would certainly benefit from it right away, especially if they wouldn't be encumbered by some of the regulatory strings that are attached to the money that they get. And so in this type of model, when you're looking at homelessness, let's empower them to do it. And I'm happy to try to address it. I'm not a definitive no on this type of approach. I understand homelessness very well. I know you've heard my story before, but for those that haven't, I grew up homeless. And so I've seen what that type of model or what that effect is on people in life. And so I don't buy into the mantra that, well, if you're a Republican, and since I am one, I know what part of my caucus says, and they think it's not as bad because they believe the other guys are lying about the extent of the problem, and I'm not there. I've continually rolled my caucus on this one issue. In fact, I'm the only Republican in the state that has the Washington Housing Alliance Action Fund endorsement, along with the WEA endorsement for my efforts on not only schools, but homelessness in schools.
Well, I was going to ask you made a comment just a minute ago about being a bipartisan position. Can you explain that a little bit, what that's been like, or what are the things, maybe where are the points that you clash?
Well, okay, so when it came to funding in the past, there were certain bills, especially when I was first appointed, but they have continued to go where the House, and especially the Republicans, were unwilling to support the sunsetting of, or were unwilling to support the extension of fees that were going to be sunsetted that actually covered for homelessness. And I would stand up on the floor, and everyone, especially in 2014 when I was brand new, they weren't expecting me to stand up and articulate a message that really favored the Democratic vote on that and moved a lot of votes in that regard. And it didn't necessarily do me any favors with some of my seatmates at the time. But I was willing to stand on that issue, even if, you know, even if it hurt me politically, because I'm going to stand up for homeless issues. I understand it. Secondarily, if you come back to this session, there are a number of key pieces of legislation around homelessness that we have championed. So, for example, I have the bill here, 1633, which had to do the coupling of monetary provisions and making resources available for homeless funding in areas that partner with local school districts, so that we can try to get family units back together, so that you don't have kids trying to learn from the back of, or, you know, from the streets, you know, so they can actually have a home. I was homeless during my senior year in high school. And so I co-sponsored that bill. It had vast bipartisan support. Governor Inslee signed it, and even my opponent has lauded it as an innovative approach that he would consider looking at in the future. Although when he was given a chance in his last term in office, he chose not to support it, which I thought was interesting. But it's proving to be a key. So this is where an area where I've crossed over. I don't stand behind partisan rhetoric that way. And as a matter of fact, in this legislative session, I was the 50th vote on a key piece of legislation with regard to trying to get low-income people access to affordable housing. The 50th vote means, you know, we were basically split 51 to 48. Well, in this piece of legislation that dealt with funding for Section 8 recipients, there was a Democrat that flipped over. That bill was not going to pass. So I, as a Republican, flipped over with the Democrats on this. Well, as a matter of fact, it worked just the opposite. I flipped over, and then the Democrat felt that he had an easy get-out-of-jail-free card, so he wanted to show his support for big business or whatever, and flipped over. But it was my 50th vote. How do you think that went over in my caucus? Not very well, but I was willing to stand up for that issue.
What convinced you to do that?
Because I'm not doing.
What was it specifically about that bill? What did you see that, yeah,
well, we were on Section, there's times where we were on Section 8 housing myself. And some of the other industries, specifically, they come out, and if they want to paint a blanket picture that says people on Section 8 funding are going to be poor tenants, then I will stand against that. Are there people on Section 8 funding that are poor tenants? Sure. Do I want to force landlords to have to acquiesce to everything? No, I think there's a good middle ground. But if you want to take a stance that says Section 8 funded people, I remember I learned how to clean a house by cleaning up all the apartments we got booted out of.
So this was a bill to kind of protect those folks from eviction?
And that was the 50th vote. I was the only Republican. I got that passed on the back of 49 Democrat votes, and I was the 50th. And every other Republican in the House voted against it. See, I'm hopeful that when I talk to you guys, I mean, I can be a good politician and I can blow smoke if I needed to, but I'm trying really hard not to do that. And I would hope that part of the advocacy that you'll see is, if you look at these, I've actually stood, I've spoken where a voice was needed. I've taken votes where they were needed. I'm very magnanimously trying to work out solutions that stop the bomb throwing. I'm convinced that if we don't have that middle ground carved out in a magnanimous way, then if you start seeing the balance of power shift one way or the other, you're going to constantly see a seesaw back and forth. There's funding one year, there's not funding the next. And that's going to devastate this type of community. I'd rather advocate for an approach that both sides can agree to, and no one's really stood up in that middle ground, and I'm trying to be the first one.
Well, let me ask you.
Well, okay, so my opponent loves to get me on that phrase of fund it first, because it's become a catchphrase, and I try really hard not to say it, because I typically think it closes down discussions. Specifically, what I advocate for is a fourth budget. We need to create a fourth budget, and then, of course, I would then prioritize that at the beginning of the session. So you can come back and say, well, it sounds like fund it first. And if that's
What's a fourth budget mean?
So right now in Olympia, we have 3 budgets. We have a transportation budget, we have a capital budget, and we have an operating budget. The difference between the operating and capital's kind of plays second fiddle to the operating, but the difference between them is, well, you understand what transportation funds. It funds transportation. Capital budget funds everything that's kind of new construction-esque, that's not transportation related.
Right, right.
And so, for example, when the Turner Joy needed to get its overhaul through the capital budget, we worked, Representative Caldeira and I worked to get $300,000 for that. That came out of the capital budget, okay? And so it's funded and allocated just separately from the operating budget. But again, it kind of plays second fiddle. But I'm advocating that we create a fourth budget, because what you have right now in the operating budget is everything else. And that's where we can get down to, I think, what are some legitimate questions about, well, if you carve out education, you put it first, will there be money left? I think that there will be. But there's a greater play towards transparency that I want. So what you get in operating budget is 95% of the legislators, excuse me, and therefore 95% of the people of this state are not represented on that process. And the math is really easy, because the operating budget is negotiated by the leadership of the Appropriations Committee or the Ways and Means Committee in the House and Senate, respectively. The leadership involves 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats on each committee, so there's 8. You got 4 in the House, 4 in the Senate, and then you got a couple people that the governor sits in there, and what do you get? Those people basically, I don't want to say check out, but they're very strongly focused on that negotiation the entire time that we're down there. They do it behind closed doors. If you're an average representative and you're not on that committee, I can't go to staff and say, show me what the negotiations are. They don't share it. It's done behind closed doors. If you're on the Appropriations Committee and you're not in leadership and you want to go find out what's in that leadership negotiation budget, they won't show you. It's negotiated behind closed doors, which means that aside from about those 10 to maybe a dozen people, we're left in the dark and we're pursuing our other agendas. We're trying to get bills passed. We're trying to either work on a capital budget or, in my case, transportation fixes, other legislation. Those guys negotiate that behind closed doors. That's a very non-transparent way of doing it. And what you get is a scenario that allows me, if I wanted to, I could legitimately say yes to mental health, yes to police, yes to fire, yes to homelessness, yes to whatever thing you want to ask me about. I could say it all yes right now and I can get away with it. And that's what people have been doing. Because what they do is they come back and then in the privacy of those negotiations, which by the way includes one other group of people that aren't individuals. And can you guess who that group is?
The industry.
Industry lobbyists, yeah. They certainly have a say in those negotiations. They basically procured it through the election processes. So what happens? You get a budget that comes out with about 3 weeks left in session. And it's omnibus, it's got all this funding, and you get one from the House, you get one from the Senate, and you basically have got 3 weeks to try to figure this out, but that's not going to be the end result because usually they're different. Okay, so for example, in 2014, the supplemental budget came out and the Democrats all that year had been saying, we are going to fund COLAs for teachers. And as a new person coming in fact, I made this application to you. I was standing up in my caucus as one of the few Republicans that said we should fund COLAs for teachers.
So which budget is education?
Well, see, education is wrapped up in the operating. So you can't tell, because it's in a private negotiation within that budget, thank you for bringing that back, you can't tell what's getting funded or what's not. And so in this case, they came out and said that. So the House came out with a $249 million supplemental budget. And a line item in that $249 million was $50 million specifically to fund COLAs. And they came out and said, here we go, we're going to fund COLAs. The Senate came out, and you can do the math, it's 249. The Senate came out with a $105 million budget as a counter proposal. So 105. So 249 for the Democrats versus 105 for the Republicans in the Senate. And of course, the media picks it up and well, there's a big difference. And so they're going to go into negotiations on that again. So we see it, but then they're going to go into negotiations. Well, they come out with just a couple days left in session with a compromise budget. That compromise budget was for $155 million, which means, if you do the math, that the Senate actually moved up $50 million relative to their initial push. And that's what was passed out in 2014. So my question for you was, if the Senate moved up $50 million and the line item in the Democrat budget for COLAs was $50 million, why didn't we fund COLAs? Because they negotiated that away in the quiet of closed doors and then told teachers, sorry, we couldn't get it, it was Republicans' fault. And the Republicans come out and they say the same thing, well, we wanted to fund this, sorry, we couldn't do it, it's the Democrats' fault. It works both ways. I'm not saying anything new, you know this happens. And in this regard, the numbers show that there was $50 million that the Senate was willing to move and it could have gone to COLAs. And I called that out. And my former opponent at the time was on appropriations and was in those negotiations and promise colas. It's one of the reasons I have the WEA endorsement over him, because I showed him, he was giving them lip service. He was telling them, I've got your back, and he didn't. And it came out through the numbers. Now, with regard to your question on education and the fourth budget, if we advocated for a fourth budget and then within the schedule of the legislative calendar, you put it up at the top priority of the legislative slate, then what we're going to do is we're going to negotiate the education budget first. Okay, that's the fund first, but you put it up first in priority, and before session's over, we have to have passed that budget. It has to be the first budget that we pass. Now, what happens with regard to that is that at that point, if I come onto the scene and I tell you I'm going to support this, 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 or this, you're going to know right then and there, wow, there's still time for you to report on it, to call me out if I've lied to you, or any legislator out if I've lied to them, or if they've lied to you, and course correct if that's not what the state wants. It also empower the Supreme Court to actually take remedial action if they don't think that we're actually funding McCleary while we're still in session.
In comparison to the, not other than the timing of it, could understand that. How do the negotiations for transportation and capital work? Do they work the same way that you're describing with that small number of people? So if that still exists, it would just fix the timing of it so we could see.
Yeah, you would get, instead of 3 days.
That would be the key part.
That is part of the key part, number one. But also because it happens up front, you get two dynamics that happen. Number one, instead of having that final bill put on you with 3 days left in session, you got 3 days to read it, and it's basically agreed to, so it doesn't matter if you want to change something. So for example, I've been awarded the CTE Legislator of the Year award this session from Career and Technical Education. Now, for my advocacy of basically vocational training, giving other options to kids instead of a 4-year degree path. And that was by the OESD, which covers this area. Now, when that budget came out, again, you have only a couple days left in session. You do have the opportunity to try to put amendments on the floor. Well, the Supreme Court had said that they're going to fine us $100,000 a day. Well, at the time, that had accrued to about $19 million. And so I co-sponsored an amendment to that budget that said, let's use it.
The 19 million?
The 19 million, and let's put it towards CTE education. It needs to be funded. Our kids need other avenues. And unfortunately, on a party line vote, that failed. But it was 2 votes shy of getting passed, where we could have put that into the budget and actually empowered schools with $19 million more dollars. Instead, it didn't happen. But one of the reasons why I don't think that had a light, and I'm not going to blame the other side, but what I'm going to say is it was forced into a 3-day window. We had 3 days on an omnibus bill for the rest of us to have a say on that legislative action, or in this case, the budget.
Why does it take that? Why does it take that long? In other words, why does it end up going to 2 days, whatever? I mean, actually, you guys went through 3 special sessions last year.
Yeah, we did. Well, I would submit to you that there are a lot of people, especially in an election year, or when you have such a tight balance of power where you only have 1 or 2 slim majority, it benefits both sides to play that game. I'm not on leadership yet. I'm trying to work my way there, and I've proven to be a public advocate even if it doesn't support my party's agenda. And my advocacy here is for transparency. And in this case, if you start to move it up into the prioritization, as opposed to letting it ride out, because at the end, both parties walk away with something to blame. They blame the party rhetoric, and basically what they're doing is they're waiting for the other side to bluff, or they're waiting for them to fold their hand, and they're just going to see, well, I think that if think about this, nobody really wants to talk about raising taxes, but if you really want to fund McCleary, one of the avenues that the Democratic Party, especially the legislators out of Seattle, is advocating for is an income tax. And they really feel that they want to peg it to that, and then we'll call it good, and we'll have a single source.
Well, they'll say that they don't want an income tax. So.
What's that?
We haven't heard anybody that we've interviewed so far say they didn't want.
You won't hear them over here. In Seattle, you'll hear it.
Seattle.
In Seattle, you'll hear it.
Oh, sorry.
Now, in this case, my opponent, if you ask him this different question, you ask him if he wants to fund an income tax.
That's on our list.
Okay. Ask him if he's willing to fund or support a capital gains tax, because capital gains is imputed off of income.
How do you feel about capital gains tax?
I won't support it. No, I think that would hurt our economy. The benefit that we had in real dollars, when the governor first proposed his budget in 2015, when we came in, he was expecting that we were going to have to find some additional source of revenue, because based off of the economic numbers at the time, because he estimated revenue to be this much. But during the course of that legislative session, as we got the next quarterly report, we came out and found out that we had made 30 million more, or actually it was more than that, but we had millions of dollars more in revenue, which meant that we didn't have to raise taxes, because the economy was picking up. On a basis level, if the economy approves with no tax change, we get more revenue as a part of income tax, or excuse me, as a part of sales tax. And the reason, or B&O tax. The reason why is because the more commerce happens, the more transactions occur, the more revenue we make, and that's what happened. And so we were able to make the case to the governor, you don't need to raise taxes because the economy has improved. And since the economy has improved, we have more tax revenue. And that's how we got a balanced budget this year, or this session, without raising taxes. I believe that if you put a capital gains tax, what you're going to see is a lot of business flee the state. And if business starts to flee the state, you're going to start seeing a tamping down of the economic growth. And if the economy starts to go down, you're going to have less tax revenue, which perpetuates a bigger problem. And that's what gets in. I mean, if you look at just
let me ask it, because it's a perfect setup. Let me ask one. I don't want to lose this reform thing that you're kind of touching on. But what we do want to ask also with the property tax, the idea of a property tax levy swap to fund education. How do you feel on that proposal?
Well, that proposal is really proposals. There are different variations of it.
I guess which way do you see that working?
I'm not close to it. The truth is, there's a part of me that wants to continue local control. I've advocated for some of the levies in my districts. But what you saw a number of years ago with the spotted owl controversy that happened then was, after that had completed its course, you saw a lot of revenue that went to rural districts kind of dry up, because a lot of property tax poor districts funded their education off of revenues that came from foresting. And if you go back and you look at about the time that stops, what you see is a big uptick in local levies and bonds to try to fund schools. And what that's done is that's led us to a place now where McCleary's trying to say, you know what, you need to not fund teacher pay out of local levies. That needs to be a state priority because of our paramount duty in the Constitution. Well, one of the avenues that they've put out there is this idea of a levy swap, and there are different variations of it, and the devil's really in the details. That would say, well, property-rich tax districts have more because they have higher property values, and there are more people paying property taxes, therefore they have more money available to them for the schools, and that's not necessarily fair relative to poorer or property-poor districts. So why don't we do this type of equalization where the state takes that on and then equalizes it or distributes it equally among everybody? The question becomes, when you look at that, there are certain variations where they look and say, well, if we're going to do that, why don't we also increase property taxes altogether? And I wouldn't go for that. I'm not going to tax an elderly couple out of their home.
Are there parameters on levies you would need before you're comfortable with something like that? Like, so you don't just end up in the same...
Those parameters, yeah. Maybe on some of the levies, but more importantly, I want to make sure that if we try to find a way that equalizes out, that it works also for school districts and doesn't perpetuate a problem that we're just kicking the can down the road, number one.
You mean continued reliance on levies? You just
sure. I also don't want to take schools' ability or any local municipal person's ability away to levy. If that district wants to be flexible and wants to pursue a different course, why would I want to dry up their flexibility?
So I don't see how you could use a levy swap to equalize things, just given what you just said. Wouldn't the rich districts like Bellevue or Mercer Island just say, well, we want to pay more so that we can get the best
schools?
So
the interesting thing about the way this is politically cutting is that a lot of the districts or a lot of the representation out of the districts in Seattle that have higher property taxes or that have higher revenues that come as a result of that for their schools, their representation is willing to do it. Seattle would benefit, a lot of King County areas would benefit the least. In other words, they would lose some of the money that they have because that's going to be redistributed to rural parts of the state. But their representation is at least willing to consider it. I don't want to browbeat anybody. Property taxes are something that are important to me because it affects people real time with regard to maintaining their home. You know, we just got done spending 15 minutes or so talking about homelessness. We don't want to exacerbate the problem by coming up with a scheme or a unthorough vetted process. Now, I would note that the legislature passed another study this year. It's currently ongoing. They're going to report back to us in December about, and it really allocated some money to deep dive into this to say what are the variations of this that could work in a way that doesn't necessarily have to impact especially low-income people on fixed incomes with property taxes.
Would you have the state set teacher salaries?
Oh, I don't. No, that's not part of. That's not part of a levy swap, and I'm not advocating for that. I like the model that we have in terms of schools where people have this local flexibility to negotiate. The question was, am I in support of or not of a levy swap? And some people are either definitely against it, and I'm not against it. I'm willing to consider it if it could be a viable tool. And I'm also willing to discuss that with people. What I advocate for instead, though, is again this fourth budget. Where are you going to get the funding for that budget? Well, I think we need to stop stripping money from dedicated accounts, number one. Well, like the lottery funds. I co-sponsored a bill with Hans Dunshee, who's one of the farthest left representatives, in 2014 that would have allocated that back to schools. Why did we strip it in the first place? The legislature found something better to do with it. And that's typically what you see, is you see this stripping of funds that I think is really kind of amoral, because in one sense they justify the existence or the creation of a new tax or fee based off of what that fee is going to be dedicated to, and based off the strength of what that project might be, they get it passed. And people say, well, yeah, I'm kind of pinching pennies myself, but yeah, I can justify that. Sure, I'll vote for that because I think that's a good cause. And in 2 or 3 sessions later, everybody's kind of gone about their own business, and the legislature comes up and says, oh, I need a few extra bucks. You know where we can get it? Let's take it from that dedicated account and put it over here. And that's been going on all over the place. I don't think that we should do that, number one. Number two, I'll also note, I encourage you to go look at which party has passed the majority of the tax incentives in the state. If you go look, the vast, vast, vast majority of all of them have been passed by the Democrat Party. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. What I am saying, as someone that supports business, though, is that I don't have any historical hang-ups to reviewing those tax incentives and looking to see
incentives
to businesses to see if they make sense.
Oh,
because
you're saying you're not opposed to that. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm a business-friendly person.
Yeah.
Typically, the mantra is that Republicans are in favor of big business and they want all these tax incentives to help businesses.
Right.
And when you see the political lobbying that happens back and forth, well, that darn Republican over there supports big business, doesn't support kids. Okay, I'm advocating that I'm open to all of them. Let's look at them.
What's the judgment that you use when you would evaluate a tax exemption or an incentive? How do you tell yourself, yes, that's good, this one's outlived its life?
Well, first off, if you look at the first thing I'm going to do is there a sunset clause on it? The reason why sunset clauses were put in the first place was, number one, probably because there was a justification to it, but more importantly, probably because it's kind of like a quasi-promise, if you will, to say, I know I'm asking you to stretch to fund this, but we're going to put a sunset on it. It's only going to be here for a limited time. And minus that sunset, you weren't going to support it. You weren't going to vote for it or anything. And so there's a quasi-promise that says, hey, we're going to get this going, but we're going to sunset it. Well, why do we keep extending them? It's almost like they've been extended carte blanche. It's like a false promise. Yeah, I'm going to sunset it.
Right.
And I'm winking over here to you like, no, I'm not.
So, but the legislature does have to take action to extend it.
Oftentimes they do, yeah. And so if a sunset, yeah. Now, sometimes they do it directly. Sometimes they try to omnibus it through different bills.
Sure.
But that would be the problem. Maybe the legislature doesn't get a chance necessarily for an up or down vote on each of these sunsets. Should that?
Well,
would that be
you get an up or down.
Or would it be bogged down?
Well, you get an up or down vote on it, but that's where it comes into the hairy political talk, right? Because maybe I want to honor that pledge, and because they're extending it in a bill, well, what if that bill helps little Kathy over here?
Well,
I know what's going to happen. I'm going to get a hit at it on me saying I don't support little Kathy.
Yeah.
But at least it would be it seems like at least that would be more transparent, right?
It would be more transparent, which is why you would get more of it if you have a fourth budget for education.
Yeah.
Now,
okay, so that hasn't happened. We don't have an education budget that we were talking about a few minutes ago. You were advocating a fourth budget.
yeah, that's something I'm going to push for next session.
Okay, so now, today and tomorrow, the Supreme Court is reviewing the McCleary decision.
Yep.
Is that going to have any impact? And then along with that, what are the chances of getting a fourth budget for education to comply with McCleary?
Well, there's a number of things that the Supreme Court could do tomorrow. And I don't have a crystal ball. I can't tell you what they're going to do. I mean, we could be in session starting here. They want to close down schools or some of the things that people proposed. If they want to keep the status quo, that's another thing. If they want to up the fines, I don't know that puts us back in session, because we know that the fines are sitting in a dedicated account and they're going to go toward education anyway.
We're up to 30 million now?
Yeah.
37?
Yeah. I mean, that's going to, so since the McCleary decision has happened, the legislature has put $5.5 billion into education. And the question then becomes, well, how much more are you going to put into education and how are you going to do it? And some of the fine details, it's kind of hard, because if you think about it, if you go really look at what the Supreme Court has ruled, they don't specify specifically what they want us to do, because they can't make a legislative mandate in their decision, because that would be breaching the separation of powers. So in one sense, they're like, well, generally speaking, we want to see something like this or that. And of course, the legislature has a prerogative too, and that is, well, we're going to pass legislation. And the legislature has continued to argue, and that's what the Attorney General is arguing for right now, is that, well, we are on track to hit it. Now, I advocated on the floor, this is another area where I stepped up against my party, and it ticked off a number of people on the Democrat side too. Both caucuses, both majority parties, the Senate majority did it, and the House majority did it. So both Republicans and Democrats both put a bill up there to kick the can down the road and say, we'll take care of this stuff, and especially the fines that the legislature or the Supreme Court put on us in 2017 or 18. Ultimately, they settled on 17. Okay, I advocated vocally on the floor that we're kicking the can down the road. We should have handled it this year, and that actually cost me 2 bipartisan bills on education. They were moving. They had the ability to get voted out. I had Democratic co-sponsors. I had the chair of the Education Committee co-sponsor some of these bills, and I thought they were going to go. And I found out towards the later part of the session that they weren't going to go, because I offended the Speaker of the House, because I spoke up on that one issue, and they didn't like the fact that I called out that we were kicking the can down the road. And I'll get the bills next year. They're good bills, and they have Democratic co-sponsors, and they're good bills for education. One specifically is going to break the monopoly on textbooks. That said,
The monopoly on what?
textbooks in higher ed. I'm meeting with the president of the OCC and a number of their staff, and one of their sociology classes costs about $450 to take. The textbooks cost $500 plus. That monopoly's got to get broken. And the bill I had was called the TAVOS bill. TAVOS stands for Textbook Affordability via Open Sourcing. And I can go into details if you guys want. I don't want to.
No, using online resources, correct? That's
online resources, but also from an entity or entities that have the ability to stand up to the current monopoly, and that is corporations. I mean, I got to tell you, Microsoft or Oracle have probably built better curriculum to educate their own staff than what some of the college professors have from some of these textbook companies. Well, what if we incentivize these companies to give that curriculum to the colleges for free and to the students for free in return for some benefit to them? And I had Democratic co-sponsors on it, because this is a great way to try to, because I guarantee those textbook monopolies aren't going to bankrupt Microsoft or Oracle or some of these other companies. We could see a revitalization of affordability in textbooks if we get this.
Is it one textbook manufacturer that you're talking about?
Well, there's an industry, but they really have I don't see any industry that can justify $500 for a book.
But you're saying a monopoly, so
Yeah.
is that like 4 or 5 different companies and they all get together and they restrain trade?
Well, the publishing houses, yeah, and then if you look at the way that the industry has gone out, there's some quid pro quo that goes in there. You need to leverage our stuff. Oh, you know what? You need to buy our 7th edition now. The 6th edition isn't any good. We won't make it available to you. So kids now all of a sudden, and it forces schools to have to adopt the 7th thing, because you can't have kids on a 5th edition and a 7th edition in the same class. Because there are only so many books that are available on the secondary market. And these types of things are all gamemanship to force you to buy new books. And I would like to break that. I would much rather see this. I don't support the initiative, so there's a direct answer to it. Number one, I would much rather see that handled.
Why? Why is that?
Because the details around this and the implementation of it are complex. We've had to deal with it in the Transportation Committee. It's much better to be vetted in the legislature instead of seeing an initiative passed and then seeing the downstream unintended consequences and impacts that happen as a result of it. It's the same thing that we found with the marijuana initiative. where you had these downstream impacts. Oh, well, we didn't really consider the local funding mechanisms. We didn't understand where the money was going to go. You basically created a black market with all the green cross stores and stuff. I mean, that type of stuff, when you get into complex issues around, especially around carbon taxing and that type of scheme, you could end up with someone challenging it. You could have it thrown out. You could have us in limbo because we don't know what's going to happen. That type of tax is also, or if the initiative is also very discouraging, and you have industry coming back and articulating a number of different worrisome points about what will happen with regard to that. And at the end of the day, too, we need to make sure that our economy continues to improve. Well, we don't know what the final amalgamation of that is, because it's some of the final amalgamation or the final decisions of what that bill, or what that initiative, if it's passed, is going to be determined in the courts, which are going to happen months from now, because parts of it will be litigated.
Are you just opposed to legislation by initiative in general?
No.
Or this particular one?
This particular, well, there's two carbon ones out there too. You have two competing initiatives, by the way. So now which one are you going to get? What happens if both pass? That's certainly going to be litigated. Which one has precedent? See, these types of things happen, and this would have been a better one to have handled, and I believe we should handle in the legislature. And I believe there's a number of Democrats that say the same thing. So it's not necessarily a partisan stance.
Could I ask you something? I noticed at your website you've been endorsed by the NRA, and you seem to have a lot of support from gun rights groups. So you want to expand on your position on that?
Well, I'm a strong supporter of the Second Amendment. I try not to hide behind that. I mean, I'm not going to tell you that. I have an A+ rating with the NRA. So, I mean,
how do you feel about that initiative then?
The industry?
The initiative. We're voting on an initiative that was to prevent firearms from certain, if there's...
you mean 594 previously?
594 with the mental illness and things like that.
Is that the new... No, well, 594 is the one that passed previously. You're talking about one
this is the one that's this fall. Yeah.
Oh, man. Let me respond. I haven't even looked at initiatives. I'm in a tight race. And I work too, so, yeah. I'll get to those in the same time voters do. Yeah, I haven't really seen them. I'm not opposed to legislation around mental health, though. I mean, that's really where the problem is. I'm worried, of course, if you know the general talking points between R's and D's on that. So with regard to mental health, I think that's, if Republicans are going to say that we need to address mental health with regard to that, then you better be honest about it.
Very, very brief. I'll just give you a very cursory. It's giving some enforcement where there's domestic violence history of mental illness, things like that. There'd be restrictions on ownership for
okay, so
something like that. In general, and I'm not asking for a yes or no, but in general.
So I'd have to look at this specific initiative.
Sure.
I can tell you that we have seen legislation. I've had people come down into the legislature that have advocated off of the allegation, or advocating legislation that says, and the bills were written, I can't remember who sponsored it, I didn't support it, that said if an allegation is made of that, then you lose your gun rights, and I would not support that. I believe that you're guilty or you're innocent until proven guilty, and that's the model that we should base it. If that initiative has any provision like that, I would not support it.
If there's more than just allegation, though, if there's documented history, things like that.
If a court rules on it, then I don't have a problem with that, if it goes through the adjudicated process.
Similar to how felons would be treated.
Yeah. But not before a court rules, or a trial by jury. Well, okay, so I know that I did not get your endorsement 2 years ago. And, okay, you take those in stride, but I certainly am encouraged to want to get your endorsement, and I would love to have it. I would say that I noted that when you guys wrote about it, I don't know that you necessarily said anything bad about me, but when you made the endorsement to my opponent over me, you made it based off of, or at least in your written text, that you thought because he'd be in the majority that he'd be more likely to be effective. I'd like to say that I think I've had one of the most effective minority freshman records in recent history. I made a promise to all of you that I would get and be the first legislator to stop the tolls from going up on the Narrows Bridge, and I delivered on that promise. Nobody has ever done that before since that new bridge has gone up. I stopped those tolls from going up. I delivered that. I did it from the minority party, especially, and I hope you understand the importance of that, because that took a lot of negotiation when you're in a minority stance to work with a chair of a party that's not necessarily looking out for you and has their own agenda, but I magnanimously offered and continued to work with them to try to find solutions that would benefit the state in return for getting a solution for our toll payers. And I can tell you, I'm in a targeted race. I'm pretty sure the speaker was not happy once we got that transportation budget passed and he found out that we had to fix in there for toll payers, but I got it done. That's through sweat equity, and I work hard. The next thing is we got a balanced budget without raising taxes, and more importantly, without putting more debt on our kids. I think that's vitally important, especially given the debt posture that we have in the state and as a nation. I also made another claim around education, and that was, again, that I was going to stand up and I was going to be a big advocate. I got beat up by my opponent 2 years ago saying I didn't support education. Well, the fact is I'm now standing before you again as the only Western Washington Republican that has a WEA endorsement. I didn't fool those guys, but I kept my pledge to be a bipartisan voice for them and be a voice within my caucus of reason to stand up and support teachers, to make sure that their pay is consistent, to make sure that their COLAs are funded. In addition to that, we cut college tuition for kids, the first time in the nation that has happened. That was a Republican-led effort that I helped with. And I kept those pledges. I would also say that I've been one of the leading and most vocal advocates for removing top-down mandates on our teachers so that they actually gain the flexibility again to teach our kids. And that's another reason why I have their endorsement. These are all pledges that I made. They were all pledges that I made in a measurable way so that you could measure whether or not I did them. And I stand before you saying I accomplished every one of those tasks. And I find that if legislators are willing to do that, most are not willing to, because if you put a measurable out there, you can be measured by it. And certainly an opponent 2 years hence is certainly going to be motivated to tell everybody if you didn't live up to your obligations.
So what do you want, what's your pledge now for this time?
My pledge this time is I'm going to start the process to cut the tolls on the bridge. Toll by Coffee Act. I don't know if you've looked at that. This is a legitimate proposal. The City Council of Gregg Harbor has already lauded the proposal. I've worked with the chambers. What this does is the WSDOT has come out and said that they don't want to fund or necessarily pay or occupy the toll booths anymore. And if you think about tolling on 520, they don't have toll booths at all. So they just want to put everybody through transponder. And when they first brought that up in 2014, it really got me thinking. It's like, well, what an eyesore. We have those toll booths there. What are we going to do with them? Well, why don't we put them to productive use? Now, in this case, what this bill would do, it's called, again, the Toll by Coffee Act. It's meant to be catchy so people talk about it, but it is a legitimate proposal. Right now, we pay $6 million a year for people to operate those toll booths. That includes the operation and the technology to remit the payments back to us, to the state. Now, as a point to understand the relative scale, to stop the tolls from going up this year, all we needed was a $2.5 million budget allocation from the Motor Vehicle Fund into the Tacoma Narrows Bridge Fund, just 2.5. What if we could save that $6 million allocation every year, but what if we could add to it and make it positive? And here's how. If you take those toll booths and instead put out RFPs or empower WSDOT to put out RFPs, requests for proposals, basically asking companies to bid on taking over the ownership of those toll booths, you would see a lot of companies, specifically companies like 7-Eleven, Starbucks, McDonald's, Burger King, Dunkin' Donuts, bid to take over ownership of those toll booths to sell their wares, specifically coffee. Now, why is that important? Because companies like Starbucks have already shown, you know what we could do? We could, above the toll booths right now, we could build our production facilities right above it, and we could just drop the coffees down. And all you'd have to do is go onto your phone, like I am right now, go to your apps and pull up your Starbucks app right there, click on it, and when you sign into this, when you set up that app, you're already setting your default location for where you want to pick up your coffee and what your default drink is. You can go, I'm getting in my car, go boom, I want my cup of coffee. And now imagine you're driving up to the Tacoma Narrows Bridge into the toll booths, and you want this cup of coffee, and there's a reader board up there that says, go in the lane 4, Jesse Young, there's your cup of coffee. And as you're getting your cup of coffee, they're not only collecting the fee for the cup of coffee, but they're also charging your tolls and collecting them for us for free.
Starbucks said they could do this?
These companies are all willing to bid on it. It depends on the RFPs that we go out. But all these companies were talked to beforehand, and all of them are willing to. Now, what you have overnight is you'd save $6 million a year because we're no longer paying somebody to be there. But secondarily, the #1 volume store in the state is in Tacoma. The amount of volume that you'd have, 50,000 cars a day that you could distribute between those 6 booths, is 3 times the amount. Don't quote me on that, but you get it. It's a lot more. Okay, and these guys would make a lot of revenue from people that would want to stop off and buy their cups of coffee. Now, this was negotiated to the point with such a legitimate deal that the Democratic chair and the speaker agreed to let me get that in the budget so that we could get a study to figure out what points we would put in, or tell WSDOT to put in their RFPs. Things like provisions that say you have to always collect the toll even if they don't want to buy a cup of coffee. Great. I don't want to buy a cup of coffee. You're still going to collect my toll and give it back to the state.
Oh, they still function as booths?
Yes, they still function as booths.
I was thinking you'd force everyone to a transport.
No. That would be one of the provisions that we wanted in there.
Okay.
But if you and I want to start up a Starbucks on the corner over here, we have to go through all those provisions anyways. We have to figure out all of our financing. We're going to have to figure out how our budgets are going to work. And in this case, provisions around queuing, how long would you queue, and what would be the ramifications if you queued too far. Those are the types of things. Unfortunately, I had everybody in the House, everybody in the Senate, on both sides of the aisle agree to this, and the governor's section vetoed it out, the study, to give WSDOT. So we have private study going on right now, and we will pursue this again. And my goal is with that is you could see a net turnaround of $10 to $15 million a year if you add the leasing fees that we would charge them to be there. Just like if you and I were going to open up on the corner here, we're going to have to pay a lease for the building. And you lease those out, so you're saving $6 million, you're going to get the leasing fees. And you also deal with something that nobody's talking about that's over the horizon, and that is, what are you going to do for maintenance on the bridge after the tolls are paid off? This would be the facility that would guarantee that the tolls go away, because the revenue that you would generate from it to the state would always be dedicated to the maintenance of the bridge. It's a real solution that will allow us to reduce the tolls.
Interesting. Most creative thing we've heard in this. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.